So what I'm going to do is just tell you a little bit about how the brain processes fear and anxiety, and then we'll take a little bit of a look at some of the results from Autumn's recordings during the movie itself. So the story of understanding of fear in the human brain starts essentially with some discoveries about an area of the brain called the amygdala, which is an almond-shaped area right here, which is in the medial part of the temporal lobe. And it's got several different nuclei within it. And you don't have to remember what each of these nuclei are. But importantly, one of the key features is that there's this sort of pathway of information flow that comes into the lateral part of the amygdala and eventually makes its way particularly to the central nucleus, which is the output zone. Now, some of the first real evidence of the importance of this brain area for the emotion of fear came from neurosurgery studies in which people who had epilepsy focused in the medial temporal lobe around the amygdala or the area behind it called the hippocampus. They started doing work, particularly up at the Montreal Neurological Institute, where when they were going to, what they'd find is some of these seizures very difficult to control through any pharmacological techniques. And really, at a certain point, the only way to control them is to do neurosurgery and remove that area of the brain from which the seizures are coming. But in doing that, they would try to map different brain functions in different areas, and they take electrodes and they would essentially insert them down into the brain and they'd give a little bit of electrical zap in there. And one of the stranger things about this sort of neurosurgery is that people are awake while they're being operated on. And sometimes when they would give electrical zap to this region, the person out of the blue would experience terror. And this was some of the first evidence that this area was critical. There also had been doing some studies in animals where lesions of this area would make animals tame, where they normally react with both potentially anger or something similar to anger, or as well as sort of fear responses. The other thing that developed in studies of this brain region was its importance for learning to be afraid, for fear conditioning, in which what would happen, for instance, and many of you have heard of Pavlov and Pavlovian conditioning, where what you'd have is a conditioned stimulus, something that had been previously neutral, but if it was paired with something aversive, the neutral stimulus would now be able to trigger that response, that same sort of fear response, as if the animal or person was being exposed to the unconditioned stimulus, in this case a shock. But now the neutral stimuli could do it, and it turns out that this learning really depends a lot on the amygdala brain region. The other thing that's really critical about this region is its ability to control this wide range of areas that give us the breadth of a fear response, ranging from areas that control your heart rate, a galvanic skin response, which we'll talk about in a moment, things like pupil dilation, which will, when you're aroused, your pupils will become expanded. It would also control things like startle responses, which we make a lot of use of in a movie like this. You notice what we do is we will get ourselves worked up, and then boom, there's something to just pound at us. And some of that is controlled through, or at least modulated through this area, the amygdala. And so we've got this range of responses, and the central nucleus of the amygdala can control this broad swath of them. Also will, of course, control fear expressions, the actual movement of our face. And one of the ways, we did not do this with Autumn here, but one of the ways we could do this would be to put electrodes and do EMG, where we'd put electrodes particularly right above the eye, right here, and you would get this even if you don't even show the full facial features, the muscles will actually show it, and we can record that as well. Now, what we did was focus here on a simple recording, which was of arousal through the galvanic skin response. And this is essentially caused by a sweat response on one's hands. This is the same thing that we measure when we, for instance, do a lie detector test. What they're looking for is when they present a certain words or set of descriptions, whether the person shows a heightened arousal, and they capture that by this sort of change in the sweat response on the hands. Now, Petey's did our recordings here today, and why don't you come up for a second, Petey? And one of the things she did was she took a few screenshots from Autumn's responses during the films. And what I want you to do, Petey, if you can just sort of explain what we're seeing, and then there's a mic there for you, and where in the film we were at the time.
Perfect. So this is from, I think it's about midway through the film. This is the first time that the mother sees the Babadook. So as you can see here with Autumn's response, it's pretty low, and we see these 3 different peaks. So the first peak comes when she's in the living room with her son, and she looks out the window, she sees the old lady, and then she sees the Babadook behind him. So we see we're pretty fine, oh, we're getting a little scared, and then there's a really high peak. Is it?
Green button.
Green button. Right there. So she takes a deep breath. He's not there anymore. Watches some TV with her son, and we see it go back to normal. So you're pretty relaxed. Everything's fine. Nothing to worry about. So she puts her son to bed, goes back upstairs, and all of a sudden she hears something in the bedroom. What is it? Oh, we go back up. Is it the Babadook? No, it's the dog. So now we're calm. Okay, I don't know, going under the sheets, but we're feeling a bit better. And okay, they got us twice. There can't be a third time. Everything's fine. So she hears something else, and this peak is the highest of all of them. Goes all the way up. The Babadook is then in the room, goes into her mouth. We see maybe right here, Babadook entering, right there, jumps down her throat, and yeah, we're totally done after that. So I think this is a really interesting clip from the film, because you do see this kind of how the film's narrative really keeps you on this roller coaster going up and down, and that's really mirrored with your response, which is extremely typical. Like, that was a really freaky part. I'd be surprised if this kind of stayed at a low arousal.
I'll take the zapper. Thank you. First off, I want to actually give a hand for Autumn here. Autumn, can you stand up for a second? She volunteered to do this. I'm not sure how much her friend put her up to it, but I thank you very much for it. It is a very clear response, and you can see, what's one of the things that's nice here, though, is you see the way our body sort of calms itself back down again, and then can get revved right up, and very quickly. Once the event happens, you can just see the peak come at a rapid rate. Now, one of the other things that ends up turning out to be really important here in the way the brain processes a movie is that the fear conditioning itself is what a lot of our research did for a while. This, by the way, is a very old person's brain. This is not a healthy brain that I'm showing, but it demonstrates something that I want to point out. I don't know why I chose such a poor brain, other than that it's labeled well. I mean, really, if your brain looks like this, you're in trouble. But here's the area, the amygdala that we've been talking about, but there's another really important area. And what happens is there's a stretch of gray matter that actually comes from the central nucleus, and it makes its way up here to this area that's right here, which is called the bed nucleus of the stria terminalis. What's important there is this area, rather than being involved just in fear conditioning, it's involved in contextual fear. What I mean by that is you don't actually have something that tells us, right now, I'm under threat. Rather, it's the context is potentially threatening. The context is dangerous. And a lot of what happens in the film is this sort of contextual setting. We're uncomfortable. We're worried something's going to happen, but we don't actually know what. We don't know when it's going to happen. And this ends up being, I think, one of the key things in making a film like this, is setting that parameters, that space up, where we're worried, we've got these cues that something could happen. It could be in the music, it can be in the way the visuals are being presented, but they can keep this and they can put it for a period of time such that, in fact, when we get that startle response, it's enhanced because we are already in this state of arousal as we were worried that something might happen. And so, when in a film something like this jumps out at us, if we had just seen it, just sort of like it just happened, yeah, we probably have somewhat of a startle response. But when you do it in the context of having had this buildup over time, that's when we get the greatest responses. That's when we, jump out of our seats. There are a couple things I want to touch upon in the movie. I had actually not seen the movie before, but there were some things I knew about the movie going in. One of them, and I think this shows up in a number of films and a number of stories, is actually the fear that one is going insane. And with the way the dreams happen and the way the heroine in this film develops, you're not quite sure what her mental state is, but you can see that it's deteriorating. And there is, in fact, something that's had a name for many years related to essentially a fear of losing one's mind. That's sometimes been referred to as dementophobia, using the original term of dementia or losing one's mind, or agatophobia, which essentially means the same thing. And you can imagine in the period of time where someone's so stressed out, one's not getting any sleep, there's a point where it's not really clear what is reality and what is not reality for this woman. And in fact, we as the audience are not totally sure. What is being dreamt, what's a nightmare, versus what is actually happening in reality. But this sort of fear of going crazy is something that I think we as a population, since we're aware of disorders like schizophrenia, we are aware of the possibility that we ourselves could go crazy. And there are individuals who just get very focused and fixated on this idea that they're going to lose their mind. This is from someone who actually has obsessive compulsive disorder, but was periodically felt like their mind was out of their control. And I think the statement in here also actually picks up on something in this movie where this person says that they're going to be essentially institutionalized, no one will care about them, they'll be all alone, and there's no way back from this. And this sort of isolation that the character faces in this film, I think, picks up some of that. Just a couple other things, and then I'll open it up actually for a few questions, and then let you guys go home and hopefully not have too many nightmares tonight. One of the things I just wanted to make a sort of a clarifying on is, and this movie in some ways plays off of this a little bit, is the difference between nightmares and night terrors. And nightmares refer to something usually actually happens later in the night. When you wake up, you have a clear memory of what happened, but you also very quickly recognize that it was just a dream. Night terrors, the person does not actually fully awaken to. They're not fully conscious or fully aware of the distinction between what's going on in reality and what's happening in terms of their dream life experience. This is something one will often see with children, where they will be for instance, they'll wake up screaming, you try to interact with them and they're not there fully yet. I will note I have had the unfortunate experience of having someone wake up next to me in one of these states. I later found out they thought my face was melting like it was a wicker face or something. It's a bad sign, but I ended up marrying her anyway. There are, of course, things that do show up in terms of people that are risk factors for nightmares. One of the biggest one being traumatic events. It can be part of a post-traumatic stress disorder or acute stress disorder. Also often features themes of recurrent preoccupations. And in some ways, one gets a little bit of this sense in the movie where the preoccupation with the Babadook in the daytime comes in and starts occupying what's going on in the nighttime as well. Now, the only other thing I wanted to talk about is this crazy thing that we humans do, which choose to get fear. I mean, think about that. Why would you choose to get afraid? This doesn't seem like a great thing. We generally try to avoid things that give us negative emotions. Most people would say, having fears is something they really want to get away from. They will take medications, they will seek psychotherapy, and yet all of you chose tonight to come into this movie theater to get scared. And the question is why? And actually, let me ask you guys, a couple of you in the room, why did you choose to come see a scary movie tonight?
A sense of accomplishment. I don't like scary movies, and so when I sit through one, it feels good.
So I actually think this is a major thing, because one of the things we do is we can get a sense of mastery. We survived it, we were brave enough to experience it, and this is really important. Interestingly, in the movie, I think there's also some modeling of this in a certain extent, where she, by the end of the film, is mastering her own fear. And this shows up in a number of movies where the heroine or the person who's most being threatened at the end is able to survive it. They're able to kill off the boogeyman. They're able to control it. And this, in fact, I think helps us in the sense of if we're really threatened, we may be able to rise up and control it ourselves. And I think this is an important feature. Any other reasons that people came tonight to get scared?
A sense of controlled arousal, a sense of bringing us out of our comfort zone in a way that we knew was safe, but at the same time challenges what we do every day.
Yeah, so it does, and again, that's part of that sort of mastery-like experience, that we can do it, we can face it, we can also do it in a manner that we can control. We could walk out if we wanted to. This, of course, can be done easier if we choose, for instance, to do it in the daytime, on television, on a video where we can stop it when we choose to. Coming to see it in the movie theater is almost always scarier, with the possible exception of watching it alone at your house in the dark.
I'm coming, sorry.
We're going to make sure you get some exercise,
Okay,
Zach.
that's good. I need it.
I actually came hoping that you could answer that question for me.
Yeah.
I'm part of an online group that really enjoys being scared, and a lot of us express the same feeling of we crave this, and we're not really sure why. We're hoping we're not crazy.
Yeah, so this is actually something that we see in a range of things. It's not just scary movies. There is a adrenaline junkie quality about it, where people really, in fact, have a pleasurable response that comes from the excitement of something that maybe itself be scary. And there are different ways to do this, but they show up in similar ways. In the sense of, I actually, in a couple weeks, I have a guy coming into my lab who's an extreme athlete. He's a motocross jumper, and we're going to do an fMRI study with him to basically try to look a little bit about what his brain does in a threatening sort of situation. And the thrill of that sensation, whether it's going on a roller coaster, whether it's speeding down on skis, anything where there's this sort of exhilarating thrill, but also that's pushing us in some ways to our limits of what we find acceptable or tolerable in terms of that risk level. And so, one of the things that will happen, though, is that you may start to crave more. Meaning, it's not enough to just watch that thing again or to go, yeah, that was okay, it was a little bit scary. You want the thing that's going to push it to a further amount. And in some ways, there's an almost addictive-like quality in that one develops a certain level of tolerance, and one needs to push it further. And it's one of the reasons why if you sort of go back in time, you watch some old movies and you're like, that really wasn't that scary. And it's because we've already adapted to that level, and we're trying to push that to another degree. Interestingly, though, there is evidence that some of these threat situations, they engage some of the same circuits that addictive agents do. Areas of the brain like the ventral tegmental area, you don't need to remember that, there's not a quiz at the end, but it's an area that makes dopamine, which is one of the key neurotransmitters that drugs like amphetamine and cocaine act on, and there's evidence that it can get pumped up in these sorts of situations, and it can be addictive-like in certain respects. So you are not alone, and it doesn't mean you're going crazy there. There's one other thing that I think is really useful in terms of thinking about why this may be appealing to us, and it has to do with some of the sort of day in, day out drag of life, where, we can get fairly bored and in a rut, or we can get very much in our heads. And one of the things that something like this does is it gets you fully aware and present in the moment. You're not thinking while you're watching this about, oh yeah, when I go home, I have to take out the garbage. That I have to, oh yeah, tomorrow I've got to do X, Y, and Z at work. You're fully present and engaged. And I think there's a real value for us. This is something that we do in very different ways at times, whether that's going to a concert, something we do in reading a book, but we try to move ourselves away from sort of the humdrum, and this makes us here in the moment, in the flow of the moment. And I think that's a powerful experience for us in our daily lives, to have those moments where we're fully engaged. And a good film does that. And Zach, do we have time for a few questions? Where are we at?
Yeah, if you guys have any questions, we can go there. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. Doctor, in doing studies of the human brain, like a regular human brain compared to someone who is a true psychopath, you showed earlier the response on the hands, where the sweat glands can engage, and you mentioned a polygraph test. I've read that true psychopaths can pass that test because they don't engage the same way, even from a biological standpoint, as a normal person does. Is there any evidence that their amygdala may be defective or somehow different than a normal human brain? And if they were to watch the same scene of the Babadook as she did, that they may have somewhat of a flatter curve in their response?
So you're dead on. Well, that's not really the word I should use tonight. But you've read properly here. One of the ironies of the lie detector tests is that the people who are most likely to pass them are the psychopaths, who are, of course, the most likely to have committed the act themselves. The rest of us, you say to us, hey, did you murder Jim last night? We're like, oh my God, I didn't do it, but that's a pretty strong statement there. We start showing that response. The psychopath is just like, no, I did not kill Jim last night. And there is evidence that there's certain brain areas which are much more blunted in their responses in those individuals. That in one of the areas being the amygdala, there's an area in terms of the frontal lobes, which is basically an area called either the ventromedial prefrontal cortex or orbital frontal cortex. It's the area sort of above the eyes, if you sort of went upwards from the eyes into the brain. And that region, there's evidence of it having both weaker responses at times in people with psychopathic characteristics. There is evidence that people who get that area lesioned by damage, for instance, they have an aneurysm in that area or a tumor in that area, and they become what we've sometimes referred to as pseudo-psychopaths, or to have acquired sociopathy, saying that they weren't sort of like born this way, they didn't grow up this way, but the damage changed their responses. They're no longer responsive to risk. They make all sorts of bad judgments frequently because they don't have that sort of sense of, oh my God, I could lose $1,000. They're like, yeah, sure, put that $1,000 down for Vanderbilt's going to win the Final Four. Obviously not this year, but these guys lose that ability, and they do get this blunting of their affective experience, particularly in terms of fear or worry. And so bring one of those people in, watch this movie. They may enjoy it. They may actually take pleasure in watching the negative experience of the people, but they're not afraid in that situation. Now, there's a positive upside of that. If you're sending someone into a wartime situation, they're not going to choke in that situation. They're going to carry out those sorts of horrible deeds that they feel needs to be done. Of course, the problem is for most people who are true psychopaths, they're not really all that into doing that for, the sake of the other people, the sake of the country. It's really typically all about themselves and what they can take advantage of in that situation. But your question was great. Yeah.
In the discussion about why we seek this out, there's brought up mastery and the adrenaline. I wonder what your thoughts are on when Freud talked about Thanatos and our fear of death, that we try to find ways in everyday life to engage death so that we can possibly feel better about it.
So you've clearly been reading the psychological literature. I mean, do you have a doctorate? Is this just what you do on your spare time, read a little Freud before bedtime? Yeah, so, I mean, there is this idea that Freud did speak of and write about, which was this concept, which he was writing in some ways looking at in terms of the world wars, both I and II, and particularly sort of build up towards World War II, and saying, why do we have this sort of what he called a death instinct, which was both one of killing others, but potentially putting ourselves in risk of dying. And he was trying to explain, evolutionarily, he said that doesn't really make that much sense. We should be looking towards life and not death. And his idea was that there was a pull towards this. There is a pull for many of us towards a dark sense of humor, to dark experience. We enjoy, in fact, reading, scary stories. And to Freud, there had to be a deep-rooted component that pulled us in that direction. People like Carl Jung, of course, also picked up on some of these ideas with an idea of a shadow self, a much more animalistic side of us. And you could almost even in the movie get a little bit of sense of the animalistic side of our heroine as, you know, she starts to go over the edge and heads into that darker direction. So it's clearly something that, whether you think positively of Freud's specific concepts or not, I mean, it's something we clearly pay attention to, and in many cases seem to actually seek it out.
All right, that seems like a really wonderful place to end it. Thank you so much, Dr. Zald, David Zald here, and we got Petey
And
over
thank you.
on the ones and twos, as it were,
And Marcus.
and Marcus.